Welcome to the Classical Commons Podcast, a conversational podcast exploring the ideas, people, and trends in classical education. I'm Rob Jackson, founder of this digital platform, which is here to connect classical schools, their communities, into a nationwide resource of talent and other things that they need. Today, we've got a guest, a classicist, a colleague and friend, Alex Petkas, who has founded the Cost of Glory podcast. But it's more than that. I consider it kind of a combination. Aspen Institute, Toastmasters. He's got tutorials and seminars with his colleagues. And he does this within a growing network of men who are inspired by greatness. Welcome, Alex.
Great to be here, Rob. It's great to see you as always.
Tell me this. Did I get it right? Is it Aspen? Is it Toastmasters? Is it all of that? You know, what are you doing over there?
Yeah, we aspire to outdo all of those things in a spirit of zeal. Outdoing your forebears in a spirit of respect. So it's kind of complicated to explain to people sometimes. But sure. I just start with it's the Cost of Glory podcast usually.
There you go. Well, that's how you launched, right? 4 years ago. And we'll get to that in just a minute. But I really want to talk a little bit about how you got interested, like what drew you into the classics. You were a college student. You eventually went on to grad school in the classics, one of the most prestigious institutions in the nation. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But how did the classics first catch your attention?
Yeah, I was not a good student in high school. I was into video games, and after I kicked that habit, I was into girls, and it was low on my priorities to do my schoolwork. But I did take Latin in high school at my public school in Houston, Texas.
Okay,
and I enjoyed it, but I never put any effort in until my senior year. We started reading Virgil's Aeneid. And I had this sense that there were bigger questions, that I had kind of struggled with things in my life, and there was some great tradition that I had not had access to, some kind of cultural refinement or wisdom or something, and something kind of clicked for me. And so I actually started studying Latin for somewhat more seriously my last year of high school, just kind of to be a good student, and not really with any ambition to go and study classics in college or anything like that. So I kind of put it aside after I left high school and didn't think much of it. But it did kind of give me this sense entering college that I had a terrible education, which I mostly blamed myself on. And now in retrospect, I kind of think that the public school that I attended, and many public schools, are very deficient, and they've gotten worse probably in the last 20 years. But I entered college with the sense that I needed to make up for lost time. And so I was kind of flailing around, taking a bunch of courses and fascinated by everything, and the life of the mind. I took history courses. I took politics, political theory courses. And I would say it was two strands that kind of made me a classics major pretty late, almost too late to switch majors. And that was one, reading the works of Plato, who I'd never encountered. But it was Plato's Republic, probably. The Apology really struck me. But it was in a politics course, actually, that we took these, read these books seriously, very, fine-tooth comb. Aristotle's Ethics we also read, and the Politics. And I thought, the Greeks actually have a lot to offer.
Yeah.
And then there was this other strand that was, I was raised in the Greek Orthodox Church, still a practicing member, but I never knew Greek. And so I thought, because we're third, fourth generation, and I thought, well, it would be cool to learn Greek so I could connect better with my tradition. Maybe I could speak to the old ladies at church, or maybe I could understand a word of the liturgy that is, half in Greek or more often. And so I took, all we had was Attic Greek at my school. And I thought, what the heck is Attic Greek? But maybe this is closer to something that would be useful. And so I enrolled in this Attic Greek course, and kind of out of personal interest rather than any career ambition. And it just blew my mind. I had a very talented professor who was young, and also a Christian, and could draw these connections between the Greek philosophers and the vocabulary they use for things, the soul, logos, and with the Christian tradition.
Mm-hmm.
So it was kind of like I had been, given some kind of brain program that helped me see the little strange figures that made up the matrix. It was so explanatory of Western civilization and the concepts that we use for things. I was addicted before the semester was
Yeah.
over. And that was my junior year, and I just wanted to go deep, 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 and it was this kind of a thirst for knowledge that I had felt, and then I read about in Plato, and I also had a sense of I think this is important to emphasize about not just for my story, but what the classics are. I had developed this sense from reading a few of these books and kind of asking around that the classics had in the past been a route to kind of crafting your character for public life. That it was going to be useful for me somehow in doing something ambitious, whether it was going into business or politics or something, that to have this classical paideia, this background of understanding and what things really were and where things really came from, and analysis. And I really enjoyed the grammar stuff too, as it's pretty rare, but that was a thing that my professors commented on. This kid's really into grammar. So
he could sniff out a geek when he smelled
him. Yeah, it takes one to know one.
Yeah.
So when I heard that you can go to grad school and study this stuff, and if you get into a good school, they'll pay your way and give you a stipend, and you can teach it and get paid and study it and not have to take on mountains of debt and odd jobs. That system might be changing with what universities are experiencing now. I was like, all right, sign me up. How do I, where do I sign? And so that was kind of how I ended up in grad school studying this stuff, and eventually becoming a professor almost by accident, by passion, really.
Well, this is what's lovely, right? Your story, has echoes of Dante in that the muse or Virgil caught your attention and gave you some guidance. So thankfully you weren't midway through life. It was in the early stage. But the fact that in roughly 4 years you go from kind of not much to talk about, and you're certainly not with any ambition, to a complete turnaround, right? Really tapped into your passions. And that it really was from these great classic authors that gave you some inspiration, that just really drew you out of the cave, right? As Plato speaks of it.
Yeah. And I think that you don't do well in any subject if it doesn't resonate with you somehow, and really capture not just your intellect, but your emotions, and give you a sense of like, there's something missing in the world, and this is the way to put it back in there. Maybe a sense of mission was really important to me. So classics seemed to offer that. It seemed to offer this lost code that was simultaneously regarded as prestigious among people who knew what it was, and then completely unknown to anybody else, and so therefore not actually prestigious in our strange day and age.
Right.
So it's paradoxical in that sense.
Well, so you speak of the power of a good teacher. I assume that your Latin teacher was also fairly effective, at least brought you up to speed such that you could read Virgil. But that Greek instructor in college really was a mentor and a guide, right? Who helped you to turn. But then if you go off to grad school, that's just a different dynamic entirely. So tell us a little bit about Princeton, right? That's where you did your grad school, both master's and eventual PhD. Was it what you'd expected? Was it what you were passionate about from that junior year encounter with Attic Greek? How was it alike or different?
That's a good question. It was very different. I would say that one of the things that characterizes a lot of the Ivy League programs, especially, is, it's so competitive to become a professor at one of these places, and publish or perish. And, the junior professors are incredibly stressed out, often quite brilliant, but, they are, if they spend too much time with grad students, they are regarded as not being ambitious by their
Mm.
colleagues, and they're
Mhm.
likely to put their tenure case at risk because why aren't you working on your book?
Yep.
And then that culture kind of breeds itself into higher ranks as well, where your mission as a professor is not really to kind of form souls; it's to publish and to be regarded well by your colleagues who are also in this kind of knowledge production game that I think is relatively new in history. Actually, the idea that the intellectuals are primarily producers of articles and books for other intellectuals who are paid to produce articles and books for other intellectuals, and that's it's a very kind of closed off bubble of a system that doesn't make a lot of sense from an outside perspective.
Well, it doesn't make sense, right, from the perspective of the young and passionate student who
Yes.
just wants to be mentored and guided, apprenticed, right, into this world of this life of the mind. But it doesn't even make sense financially, right? Because
No.
we are now reading we're probably at least 2 decades into a precipitous decline in the interest in the humanities,
Yeah.
right? I suspect in part because of the very thing you're describing, because this little intellectual cadre or club that has fed itself for decades now, and it's only speaking to itself and has thus cut itself off, right, from from the wider world and certainly from the next generation, right? That's not going to really pursue the classics. If you hadn't had that high school teacher or that great college teacher, I doubt you would have gone to grad school. You just confessed as much, right?
Yeah, and it's very cut off from market forces. They don't
Yep.
feel there's not a real structural incentive for them to preach this stuff or recruit
Yep. Yep.
or kind of be public facing in a meaningful way. So and that really translated into the vibe of the department, and it's just not that common for professors especially at the competitive programs that are producing new scholars, new PhDs, to have that mentoring. Well, they have a professional mentoring role. The people that they pay attention to among the undergrads are the ones who are going to go off to grad school and
Yep.
study classics, not the
Sure.
ones that are going to go off and contribute to political life or finance or tech. And even the grad students, it's very I there's not a sense of like, for me at least, there was not a sense of I want to be like these people. There were intellectuals that I admired greatly, and some of them were good people that I still am in touch with and admire. But there wasn't a sense that like they felt a duty to be examples.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Did
And
you study with Katz? Did you study with Joshua Katz while you were there?
I did, yeah. I didn't study. He wasn't on my committee. I took a class with him, and I really liked it. I like he's a linguist, and I've always
Right.
loved linguistics, but never. I decided not to pursue it professionally. Since leaving, actually, we've become much closer since I left Princeton, and we've collaborated on things together. And he definitely is one of the more exceptional cases where he takes that mentoring formation role very seriously, and there
That's
are
right.
still people out there, and they're becoming squeezed and
Mm.
rarer and rarer in professional academia, which is really sad.
Well, that's what I was pointing to, right? I've gotten to know Joshua just a little bit, and my sense is that he took the mentoring and the apprenticeship seriously, and brought a number of young people along really into the tradition under his influence. But that is more rare these days, to be sure. Were there other surprises, right? I mean, just to cap off that kind of analysis or the quick synopsis of your time in grad school. Any other surprises that are worth noting?
In classics grad school, I felt that the instruction there's a lot of coursework for grad school in the U.S. It is not the case in for example in the U.K. where you get sent to the library, come back in 3 years with a dissertation, and
That's right.
call us if you need anything, I guess, but don't call us that much. Whereas in the US, there's a lot of coursework, so you think that the objective of the coursework is to train you up, but very frequently the courses sort of end up becoming little, whatever the professor's interested in
Right.
publishing an
Sure.
article on, or he's working on his book, and it could be something kind of, recherche, I did a course on animals in ancient medical texts, and it was fascinating, and I was introduced to all these figures, but it seemed very scattershot. There was not a sense of, hey, I haven't ever read any Tacitus. What do you think of that? Are you going to let me through this program without having actually studied Tacitus? Yeah, turns out that's not a big problem. As long as you can pretend, that's fine. There's a sense of going a mile deep before you had even gotten an inch wide, especially in the classics, which is such a canonical focused discipline. You really have to know a lot of authors to kind of feel comfortable
to make your way. Yeah,
make your way. And so there was not a lot of pedagogy put into the program structure from my perspective. And so I felt that was sad, and I spent way too much time reading what was assigned, which was a lot of scholarship, and I should have just been kind of ignoring it and just making my way slowly through the canon,
the tradition.
But I didn't know any better at that point.
Well, of course you didn't, right? You were expecting them to give you that guidance because they were the professors. So speaking of the professors, maybe one of the more became well known in a recent article. I guess this is back in 2019 now. After you'd completed your PhD in 19, a few years later, a Princeton professor, Daniel Padilla Peralta, was profiled in a New York Times Magazine article. And he purportedly was giving an argument that classicists should knock ancient Greece and Rome off their pedestal. And that's the way the headline read. Maybe you want to give us a little bit of inside baseball as to what kind of pedestal those ancients are on or have been on in classics departments, or maybe more broadly at the university, and just what Peralta was hoping to accomplish with this attack on the ancients.
I found it so funny because it's as we were talking right before we turn on the record button, it's kind of like going to the grave of a dead person and saying this person needs to be knocked off their pedestal. They're 6 feet in the ground at this point. And the classicists have as any academic going deep into a subject sort of sees the world in this weird kind of selective way where we're aware as professionals in this discipline that the classics has held this huge prestige in Western civilization from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment. I mean, American founding in the 19th century, it's the kind of mother of all disciplines for the German research university. And, in Britain, I think there's still more residual respect for the classics culturally. They have a sense that, hey, the Romans were here before us, actually.
Yeah, right. Literally, physically here before us.
Right. And Caesar's expedition to Britain is like something that is, it's part of their national story. And so the U.S. classics culture often looks to Oxford and Cambridge to set the tone of what the discipline is, and especially if you're in the East Coast, from the kind of D.C. to Boston paper belt, as some friends of mine have called it. It's easy to kind of get into this mindset. All the private schools will have Greek and Latin, or at least Latin, and probably some Greek. The fancy prep schools, and so you get the sense that it's like the bastion of the elite. But coming from Houston, Texas, I felt that no, actually, most of America has no idea what you're talking about. There isn't actually prestige in this discipline anymore because nobody even knows what it is.
Right.
Within the university, other professors say, "Oh yes, the classicists. Those are the real whatever. The Navy SEALs of the humanities. Sometimes people call it, which is flattering. But in fact, even at a place like Princeton, your typical second year Greek course might have 3 to 5 people in it. So I felt like this idea that classics needs to change or die, kind of like a John Shelby Spong thing. It seems very, very blindered to me, and it's aiming at a version of classics that was popular in the Victorian era in the UK, that was popular in the American founding, where the Greeks and the Romans are paradigms of virtuous action. And I think that that's actually good. This is one of the things that we could stand to reinstate through the classical education system. That the classics, the ancient heroes, something I'm very concerned about on my podcast. They give us moral examples that we can follow. The philosophical achievements of Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics and on. That there's something to admire and to aspire to. And the post-colonial kind of take on all this stuff is it's just reinforcing the patriarchy, and it's all about white supremacy, which the white supremacy part I think is especially silly. But the patriarchy part I think is actually not that bad. I think, personally, I think we could use a little bit more of it in our society. But even so, the classics are very multivalent. If you have this. The basic reason that you study the classics is because they give you some kind of strength. They give you some kind of guidance. They give you some kind of inspiration to achieve more. I think that's what they're there for. That's when I look at classics as a discipline, I think that it's essentially the genealogical descendant of heroic poetry, of Homer. Homer is not just the first classical author. He sort of explains in a nutshell, in the kind of seed form, what the whole project is about, which is about inspiring present generations with great dramatic examples of the past. And Achilles is not a saint, right? He makes mistakes.
Right.
It's not like you're saying that these people that everything they do is good, but you're there to learn from that example, and it's supposed to kind of give you a shot in the arm to face whatever challenges you're going to face. And I think that's really what our main role is to serve as that shot in the arm for society.
Mm-hmm.
And so I say that he's trampling on the grave of something that was killed, probably at least mortally wounded in the 60s, and probably dead as a doornail by the time you get to the early 2000s. Yeah. But it was a good thing, actually, before it was killed. And so I think we need to bring it back.
Well, it's ironic because, of course, the tradition provides the tools, provides the weaponry, right? The critical thought that goes into the construction of these theoretical models that eventually would undo it. And yet, we hope and start to see some signs of life and revitalization that the tradition is still fruitful. And again, that's why we're involved in classical education, and you're involved in really giving voice again to Plutarch and to the great authors. So let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk a bit about your time after grad school, right? You probably were tracking here with the field because you entered it as professor, but I'm interested in what you saw on the ground, right? From the students in your classes, obviously those that you were working with as colleagues, and maybe more generally, just what the institutions looked like to you as you sat as a faculty member. How was it after grad school?
My first position was teaching as a lecturer at UC San Diego, and I taught in the ancient history in the history department. I taught a little bit of Latin in the classics department, and I had it was a whole range. I would say that a lot of people were there to just fill out their course requirements and kind of be entertained. And I tried to kind of meet them where they were and entertain them if I could. But I did notice that I tended to get approached after class by young men looking who just loved Julius Caesar or Julian the Apostate or Justinian or Alcibiades. There were people that you could tell that they were going to go on and be lawyers or financiers, but they found the material so inspiring. And I think that one of the things that they liked about me, which is no particular credit to me, but I liked to talk about how awesome these people were too. And that was really refreshing because this was sort of not the typical tone that a professor was supposed to take.
Well, you just described it, right? At Princeton, for the serious academic track, you better publish, and you better publish significantly. and you better do it pretty fast. And if you're spending too much time with students, then something's wrong with you, right? And if you are spending time with students, then you clearly, you're second or third tier at best. And why would you be doing that? I mean, after all, there are other things to live for. So you were passing along a passion that you had acquired under the influence of some good, perhaps great teachers. I'm guessing that you had a similar pedagogy and it was attractive, and you were the impresario of these classic texts. And it is attractive when you have that kind of teacher in front of the classroom, right?
Yeah. And I would, I mean, a lot of the tone that you're supposed to take, I think, or you're trained to take as a young scholar these days is, all right, how can we question the narrative? How can we problematize these figures? And I think looking at the whole truth, truth is incredibly important. You have to sift through different sources and acknowledge that, Julius Caesar is his own best propagandist, but that doesn't mean you can't admire that. But you're not, well, I taught, so my second post was a tenure track job at Fresno State in the Valley. And it's, different kind of place, the state, Fresno State versus UC San Diego, coastal versus kind of Fresno sort of getting on the fringe of flyover territory, probably but there were some talented students there. And I taught a course on the Greeks, and it was supposed to be a kind of intro to ancient Greece. And I spent a fair bit of time taking people through the Republic. And I said, I tried to kind of say, hey, there's some real wisdom here. Maybe you should live your life according to this. And I had people write essays instead of saying, analyze, Plato's argument here, problematize it. Can you give a critique of Plato's argument? Or, what values does this text reflect of ancient, instead of taking kind of a critical or historical perspective? I thought, what I think these kids really need, I say kids, but some of them are actually older than me, because that was the kind of institution it was. What I think people really want and need is, how does this relate to my life? And so I had people write essays on what lessons they could take from this text that they could apply to their lives. Just tell me a story of an experience that relates to something you've read in Plato's Republic. And I had a student kind of at the end of semester for his final paper, he confessed to me that he had been fooling around on his wife, and he was convicted by Plato's argument that you should live a just life, that justice is worth pursuing on its own. And he broke it off and had that kind of like moral conversion through this. I was just like floored at this, just reading this essay. So, I think that so often the professionalization of the discipline tends to see such interactions as kind of, sticky, problematic, dirty, and it's not what we do. And but that's kind of what the role that the classics have served for so many people. It's like a moral formation that I think that people are starving for. So the whole range really of people just punching their tickets to people kind of having really powerful transformative experiences that I, humbly was somehow a conduit for. Really, I would credit Plato most of all.
Sure. Well, your comment there at the end and that last powerful anecdote reminds me of a text we're both familiar with, and many of our listeners and viewers know C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man. And he's fundamentally saying that's what this education is about. It's trying to train the sentiments, trying to train the heart, right? Or the moral compass. And an encounter with these great thinkers can often recalibrate and give us the orientation we need, as it did for that man, which it's a powerful story indeed.
Yeah.
Now, I most of our viewers and listeners wouldn't know this, but you spent nearly a decade in industry, which I found interesting. Like, what was that, and why did you decide to go work, and how did that fit into your scheme to become a professor, or at least your original plan?
Yeah, well, I had the good fortune or the misfortune of being an only child with a parent who was a business owner, and I kind of needed some work to do on the side as my stipend was running out and I was still finishing my dissertation. So I was like, I approached my dad and I said, "Do you need anything done?" He's like, "Man, yeah." And my dad started a business in the industrial coatings industry, a small, family business, just a couple of employees. But he had a lot of work to do and he didn't really know how to get it done. And so I started, going to trade shows and selling our product on the side, and learning some of the ins and outs of the industrial paint industry, which is fascinating actually. And I enjoyed that kind of break from the heady stuff that I was doing and the kind of interaction with real people and real stakes. And as I was I was starting to get frustrated with academia. For not particularly Fresno State, which was a good place, but the kind of, the vibe that we're talking about with Mr. Peralta's article was encroaching more and more. I think there was something about the second term of Obama and then the Trump first victory that really just turned up the volume massively on kind of critical theory, cultural studies, the DEI wokeification of the universities. And I just felt like we were heading for the iceberg full speed ahead and saying it's a good thing that we're going to wreck this ship. But so in that frustration, I said, maybe there are other paths and maybe I don't need to be a professor and I can figure out what's next. And then that was the point in 2020 when I joined my family business full time and ended up taking it over and learning a lot, taking a lot of hits, having a few successes. But I think that so much of my own perspective on the classics, on what Plato did, on how ancient teachers would organize their schools, was so informed by my experience in business. How do you keep an organization together? Where's the money coming from? Where is it going out? How do you attract new students? How do you retain them? These started to seem like not, petty material concerns that don't matter anymore, but like very central to the whole project. Like, how did Plato's school survive for 1,000 years? Like, what does it take to do something like that? Not just for his books to be read, but for people to say, this is Plato's school. This is the academy, still there up to the reign of Justinian in the 6th century. Like, that was just phenomenally amazing to me, because I can see how hard it is to hold a small business together. And so it was a crash course in marketing and finance, and I took courses on Coursera. And I think that having that kind of experience just helped me relate a lot more. When I was doing it on the side, I could relate a lot more to my students. I had a student in one of my classes who's like a roofing contractor.
Yeah, right.
And I could have a lot of conversations. I had a student who's like an insurance broker, and I could ask him about his business model, and it just made our interactions so much richer to have just a little bit of practical experience. And I liked that, and I wanted more of that. And so that, I ended up doing that for a number of years until about a year ago, we finally exited the business, but I wouldn't trade it for anything.
Yeah. Well, my sense is that it gave you the kind of experience that has now permitted you to take the podcast, which you launched 4 years ago, and really turn it into something, I'll say it not crassly, but genuinely marketable, right? Because you understand there is an audience and there's a customer. And again, that I don't mean to demean the high end work that you're doing and the sort of very lofty goals and aspirations of the Cost of Glory and all that's going on there. But I mean, you're aware that there's a business model and you've got to make this thing work, practically speaking, operationally. Right.
Yeah. And universities many schools and universities could use more of a dose of that. If you want to build something that's still going to be there in 100 years or 200 or 10, these are very pressing questions for a lot of people starting new schools.
That's right.
What's the business model? How are we going to sustain this? Are we just going to pump donations into the operating budget? That doesn't make sense. Like, how do you persuade people that this is worth their time and get them to pay enough that you can pay your teachers a good salary and keep good people around, and it's incredibly important. So yeah, no, this I see a lot of value in building an honest business in whatever field you're in, and I felt like this was the way to, if I wanted to build a new classical focused institution, that I should try to, be hard nosed about it and do something that actually worked rather than just pie in the sky. Try to find some rich patron to subsidize a lofty Socratic life.
Yep. Well, tell us a little bit about how you got into the podcast to begin with. Again, this is about 4 years ago now, right? That you opened Cost of Glory.
That's
what
right.
was the prompt there? Because that's in the middle of business, right? So you've got a day job at that point. How did this come to you?
Yeah, well, when I was leaving academia, or when I was my last year or so, I started getting into Plutarch's Lives because I found them to be such a good teaching tool for getting into to helping students build an emotional connection to the material. And Plutarch's Lives, for the listeners who aren't familiar, was the most popular classical text of all in the early years of the American Republic in the 18th century. It's a biography collection written by a philosopher, by a Platonist philosopher. 48 biographies, 24 Greeks, 24 Romans, the greatest figures from antiquity: Caesar, Alexander, Alcibiades, Pericles, Cato, and Brutus, and so on. And I started assigning more Plutarch's Lives and realizing, wow, I can't believe how good this is in proportion to how little of it I've read. This is a gold mine, not just about the great statesmen, but there's all these anecdotes about philosophers and the little stories that have been quoted and memorable with lessons. And I thought, I just got to assign more of this, and I got to read more of it. And as I was starting to kind of, train my sights on the business world and leaving academia for at least a spell, I thought, wow, this actually seems very applicable to what I've been working on, and risk taking and assessing character and building institutions. I mean, these are incredibly useful and inspiring texts for people living practical lives. So I really I made a goal of just reading all of Plutarch's Lives in Greek, and I would read a little bit at night before I went to bed. And it was just such a delight. I would look forward to going to bed and reading for half an hour with a little headlamp on. And so, but it struck me, and I had also been listening to a lot of podcasts around the time, and that this new medium seemed so pivotal for intellectual life, in that the media of a society have a huge impact on the way that intellectual life is structured. Something I had studied for my dissertation. The advent of writing totally changed the Greek world. The advent of writing is responsible for displacing the poets and replacing them with historians and philosophers, for example. Those are written forms. Poetry was originally an oral
form, right?
Philosophers really need books to get their message up. Historians produce books fundamentally, and so it just changes. The printing press, right, kind of unseated the magisterium in a lot of ways. It just totally changed the structure of intellectual life. And I thought podcasting might be something like that, or the ability for people to cheaply produce high quality things, find an audience, and educate people in long form. I was listening to a lot of business podcasts at the time, trying to get up to speed on things. I thought, well, why don't and I was listening to audiobooks too. Ancient texts, even if they're written down, so many of them are meant to be enjoyed orally. Cicero's speeches to Thucydides, even all the great classical authors, some of their qualities are explainable by the fact that they're there to kind of entertain you to be read by somebody to a group of people, typically. And so it seemed like, well, maybe Plutarch, I could just listen to Plutarch on audiobook and just crank through a lot of this stuff and become a better classicist. And I found it so difficult because it's really dense, and it's a lot of the translations are old. And so the audiobook formations of Plutarch are just not easy to listen to, even for a professional classicist with a PhD. I would just get lost, if I was doing the laundry or something, or
I threw it
washing.
up on the screen here, as you can
Yeah.
see. And I just
Mhm.
think this is amazing because this is the way you lead, right? This is your about page where you say,
Mhm.
hey, I did it myself, right? I
Yeah.
was listening to it and I'm a classically trained individual and I found it just so difficult. So, hey, if you're in that company and if you've ever attempted and then sort of given up, lost hope, don't lose hope. Come over here, right?
Yeah, that was the basic idea. What if I could share Plutarch with people, get them to see how interesting and fascinating and compelling these characters are, because that's how you build a relationship with a time period. It's through individuals. You connect with individuals.
Yeah.
Um, and you connect emotionally with individuals, not with structures or the grain institutions or the whatever economic. It's individuals. So that was kind of the inspiration for the Cost of Glory. I thought, well, there's an opportunity here maybe to just retell these stories and try to keep the spirit of Plutarch, which is ultimately about character development, about learning how to be virtuous from great examples of virtue, and also great examples of vice too.
Sure.
He
Sure.
has some vicious people that he biographizes, but through great examples, that are sort of aspirational on some level, and to keep that spirit, to keep as much of the drama as possible, and to just tell the story in a compelling way and draw lessons for people out in the world who aren't necessarily nerds, though many people that listen to my show would probably qualify as classics nerds. I've got venture capitalists and lawyers and police officers and just a whole range of people, and mostly men. From the YouTube analytics, it seems like this stuff really appeals to guys. And so I kind of am making it for a younger version of myself in a lot of ways. I saw this as kind of like the route to building something bigger is just convincing a lot of people that that my take, which I think is the historical take on why the classics are important and why they're fascinating, is that take is compelling, and that they're willing to listen to me to say, hey, this is actually good, not just casual entertainment, but there's something like important here that I want to go deeper into. And so I try to kind of bring that spirit to the Cost of Glory, and it has been the basis of everything that I've done.
I'm guessing that just the fact that you went back to Plutarch yourself, right? A classicist who just hadn't dove in until you started to discover them and had to teach them. And of course, to teach them, you had to read them more carefully. But in terms of preparation, now that you're doing this on a regular basis, is there anything else that you have done to kind of connect to that audience and make sure that you're getting their questions and understanding where where you have to fill in gaps or provide what they need to really grasp what's going on in the text?
Yeah, I get emails from audience members often. I try to think about what is really necessary. What can I cut? I try to cut as much as I can of details, and I often have to kill my own darlings as I'm kind of preparing to, because I want to nerd out on this or that thing.
Sure.
But I feel like I might kind of lose people's attention. I've read a lot of books on narrative and storytelling, and try to learn from novel writers about how to build drama and conflict. And the nice thing is, it's so much of it's just already there.
It's baked in. It's baked in,
he's
right?
such a good storyteller, and I'm just trying to not screw up what he did.
Just get out of his way. Get out of his way.
Exactly. And I think you learn a lot by trial and error and seeing what resonates most with people.
Sure.
But storytelling is a learnable skill. I'm happy to report, and
excellent.
The best way to learn is from the greats.
Yeah. So what's the next 1, 2, 3 years hold for you with the podcast?
Well, I thought that I would be finished with most of I thought I conceivably could finish all the lives in about 4 or 5 years. And here I am almost 4 years through, and I'm about a fourth of the way.
Just too much good stuff in there.
There really is. And I try to read the other sources that are relevant. And so I've been doing a big arc on the Roman Republic. So if you're a fan of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, I'm covering all of those characters now. I've finished Pompey, and I'm now doing a big arc on Julius Caesar that should be done in a month or two. Going to do Brutus after that, the man who killed him. So I've also done some of the great Spartans, Alexander's secretary, Eumenes of Cardia. The first two guys that I covered, Sertorius and Eumenes, are the most unknown, but the most amazing, probably, of all the Plutarch's characters. So inspiring. So if you're going to listen to The Cost of Glory, those are still some of many people's favorite episodes, even though I think I've gotten a lot better at kind of storytelling and narration. But for the next 1 or 2 years, I want to probably leave the Romans off for a while and go back to some of the earlier Greeks, some of the Greek state founders like Lycurgus, who laid down the constitution of Sparta, Solon of Athens, a really influential figure in Athenian democracy. Maybe I'll look at Romulus, the founder of Rome, and Numa. I'm really interested in these. I think we're kind of in a new foundational moment, maybe. So founders is something that I'd like to kind of turn my attention to. And also I've done a few conversations with people on The Cost of Glory. So I'm going to see if I can bring in a few more guests. I've got a couple of figures lined up for the fall. We're going to talk, Stoicism, Julius Caesar, Aristotle's ethics, this and that. So yeah, as far as the podcast goes, there's never a dull moment, and there's always work to do. But
there is, and that tradition is replete, right, with greatness. So you've got plenty to mine in those hills.
Yeah.
But you also have a menu of other educational experiences, right? You got trips to Greece and Rome and Italy, right? An online oratorical gymnasium called the Rostra. You have a new membership network. I think it's relatively new, called the Classical Society.
That's right.
How did these elements kind of emerge from podcasting?
Well, I've felt that meeting in person is such an important part. It was such an important part of our formations. I'm sure you could agree that the kind of personal contact you get surrounding yourself with like-minded people, or having a really influential professor on you. So much of that is about being embodied. So the first thing that we did to kind of take it to the next level with Cost of Glory were retreats. We did men's retreats for a variety of reasons. And I don't think I would have gotten a lot of female applicants if we had opened it up, but just because of who the audience is. But we wanted it to be a kind of like fellowship, brotherhood, and atmosphere. And we did our first retreat in Rome, focused on what I think is the quintessential art of statesmanship and public living, which is rhetoric, something that I studied a lot of in the history of, at least in antiquity. And I thought this is something that's it's useful, and you can justify it to your significant other a little easier if it's like, this is professional development, baby. And maybe, I don't know, call it professional development, if you wanted to charge it that way for tax purposes or something. Sure. That was kind of an idea. But and we did a week-long retreat, tons of impromptu speaking. We did some instruction on the classical rhetorical framework, and we've built on that as we've gone along, and people have just had an amazing time on these retreats. And we take you around Rome and see some of the great sites where some of the great speeches were made, and then we have a kind of a private space where we give speeches to one another, toasts at dinner, and things like that. And so we've done 2 Rome retreats. We're doing another one in Greece this fall in October. There's still a couple of spaces available if that's of interest. But the focus is on rhetoric, on improving your speaking skills, that we're very serious about. And through that process, kind of character development. I think that these things go hand in hand, and we end up talking about business, fatherhood, ambitions, legacy, and just having it's a really rare group of people who love the classics, but are active in the world and building things and reading avidly, smart people. So those have been fantastic. And so on the basis of that, we wanted to do something a little bit more regularizable, maybe scalable is the word, that could open up to more people. And one of the things that the classical writers on rhetoric talk about, especially Cicero, is how the really foundational thing of becoming a great orator is practice, regular practice. All the greats just, Demosthenes just put in his hours in the petty courts of Athens, squabbles over property boundaries and inheritances. And that's how you get good, is just putting in the reps, going to the gym and doing the lifts. And so we have a new online rhetorical gym that we've started recently called the Rostra for that. And we meet a couple times a week. There's a few sessions that you can join. We're actually doing a debate competition. Probably by the time that this airs, it'll have already started, but we hope to run it again. But just to give people the opportunity to learn debate. And it turns out debate has really gone downhill. I was talking to a friend who's a retired high school debate teacher, and he said, the glory days were 20 years ago, and it's just gotten bureaucratized and kind of, I don't know, people don't want to let it get too competitive, and they don't want to offend people. And I feel like we've lost a culture of healthy debate and intellectual sparring in a kind of friendly, competitive world. So we want to bring that back. We have started doing debates on our retreats, like formal debates, and those are just a blast. And I think it's a great bonding experience actually for guys. So we're doing more of that in the Rostra too.
I think this is where it's headed. By which I mean, in classical education, in the formative years in K-12, we really need to emphasize speech and the production, not only of recitations and the memorization, of course, of great texts that can be reproduced, but the ability of students, especially as they enter into pubescence and middle and secondary grades, where they become capable spokespersons, right, for a position or for taking both sides, being able to argue, right, reasonably and convincingly to two sides of a topic, of a debatable topic. And this is really at the heart, as you pointed out, of the oratorical tradition. It's deep in the classical vein, and is perhaps sometimes kind of jostled with, or maybe even has been displaced in some sense by a philosophic that really turns towards a more technical, just how do we analyze and thus break it down and then reproduce it in one of our newer machines. And that's not sufficient, right? There's got to be an oratorical element of production where these things become really a part of the mental furniture, as they used to say, but of the inner thought, and as you point out, the character of these young people. They actually are able to think clearly, thoughtfully, argumentatively, in a good sense, right? Not in a cantankerous way, but in a sense that it's in the sparring, as you put it, that we're going to discover more of the truth, right? That we're both supposed to be seeking together. So
I think you go to a jujitsu gym, and people who are like, injuring other people are the novices. Like the real adept speakers are able to win the argument and still be your friend at the end of the day.
That's right.
But I think it's a big advantage, really urgent today with the rise of AI and the GPTification of essays. And I mean, there's been essays decrying this in the Atlantic, and it's really scary out there. But speech is something that is harder to kind of hack with AI, and it's just more obvious that this is about kind of personal transformation, shaping your character, building confidence, and embodying what you've learned, and actually kind of really assimilating it in a powerful way. It's not just like a product that you kind of can alienate yourself from after it's done and get a grade on. It's like, it's I think that classical education has a huge advantage in that space, and the kind of the question of what is education going to look like with the AI transition. I think speech is going to be a huge piece of that, in the humanities especially.
I follow you, and I'm with you entirely. Listen, I really appreciate the time you spent with me. I've got to ask you one more question, because our purpose here at Classical Commons is to serve the needs of parents, of teachers, and leaders working in K-12 classical in a variety of settings, right? But I'd like to know what words of advice you have for folks who are becoming more familiar with the classical tradition, but they'd like some tips on how to get the most for their kids by attending, right, to the ancient yet evergreen tradition. What would you tell them?
I think that for me, one of the key pieces of classical education is for helping people see, whether it's yourself or your spouse or your kids or your students or parents, donors. One of the key pieces is getting that emotional commitment to the material, the sense of that these are admirable. This is an admirable thing to do because it's put together and portrays admirable people, and so familiarizing yourself with the stories of the great heroes of antiquity is a big piece of that. Then of course there's heroes throughout the tradition of the West, and we could multiply many examples, but the ancient heroes have a kind of gravitas to them that recurs in throughout the Western tradition. And so learning the stories of Plutarch's lives, which I think is just such a great gateway drug to the classics, to tell the stories of Pericles or of Eumenes of Cardia standing up to Antigonus after he's been completely surrounded in the fortress on Nora, and the kind of raw courage of some of these people and the odds that they face. If you can just dramatize that for people, it's a great skill to have, but it's also, I think it's really convincing, and it just takes learning the personalities involved, and and you can bring in artwork when you do that. You can see these scenes, Brutus and his sons, the Horatii and the Cariati swearing, or the Horatii swearing the oath. There's so many famous paintings that you can just kind of tell the story. Leonidas at Thermopylae, all these paintings by David, the French painter. Just getting people connected with the actual people, because that's what a relationship is really about. It's connecting with individual people. So I'd like to see more of that, and I'm trying to aid that. So maybe check out The Cost of Glory if you want.
We're definitely
one person's take on how that goes.
Well, we're definitely going to encourage people to check you out. You are, of course, one of our partners, and we're proud to be promoting and encouraging people to take a look, because they can learn those stories from you and then for themselves as they dig in deeper. So we'll have those in show notes and other things. Alex, so thankful that you're able to make it with us today, and the good work you're doing. Just keep it up.
Pleasure as always, Rob. Thank you.